but it's inevitable, I think, that this will happen. Now, if we home in on Balfour, to the Balfour, what led up to it, what was the sort of context, it's very important, of course, always to look at the context of these things, and many people have done so, I know. A lot has been written about the Balfour Declaration, and a lot of history has been invoked as an explanation for this extraordinary promise made. Of course, in the immediate background, quite apart from the Christian Zionism, which Stephen has so eloquently described, quite apart from that hanging around those ideas, the immediate background, of course, was that Britain was an imperial power. You know, we have to remember that. So it's not as if we're looking at the Britain of today. This was a Britain in an age in which there was a tremendous self-confidence about Britain and its role in the world. Tremendous, in a way we probably can't understand. Quite recently, I was reading a biography of Gertrude Bell, the woman who had such a signal role in fashioning the modern Iraqi state. And she lived through the era when the Balfour Declaration was written. And what is so striking about this, the thing that really struck me was, of course, that Britain had played this role in so many different countries. But the really striking thing is letters from Lord Kitchener at the time talking about the Arabs. So this was in the context of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, of the McMahon correspondence, which people in this room may well be familiar with, about how to gain Arab trust and their support for the war against the Turks in return for a promise of Arab independence. And in Kitchener's letters, he makes very clear the British attitude. He tells Gertrude Bell, look, get this straight. I mean, obviously he didn't put it like that, but he said the Arabs will never be united, so don't worry about that. They are disunited, they're tribal, they will never get their act together. That's very painful, by the way, for us looking at the situation today. However, he then says, and really, we will tell them whatever sounds good to get what we want, but let's be very clear that this has nothing to do with what we're going to give them or what is going to happen. So in other words, the Palestinians in 1917, when we're poised to see the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the war, and the entry of the British via the British Mandate in 1922 into Palestine, the Palestinians had two sets of enemies, not just one. One, Imperial Britain, and two, the Zionist movement. It's a very, very big foe for them to try to fight. Needless to say, the news about the Balfour Declaration spread, and there were inevitably riots. Right from the beginning, in 1920, the Palestinians, the Arabs of Palestine, were rioting. They had no political representation. They had no real leadership. The way they showed their anxiety and their worry was through rioting again and again and again, and lots of unrest. And the British role throughout the mandate can really only be described as not just hypocritical and double-dealing, but in fact despicable. In hindsight, they enabled the creation of a huge problem for the region, not for Britain, but for the region. And so from the moment that they pressured the League of Nations to give them a mandate amended so that it included the Balfour Declaration. Imagine such a thing already, right at the very beginning. You have this inherent contradiction that on the one hand, a mandate is there for the imperial power to help the people towards independence, and in the case of Britain, they're supposed to be doing that at the same time as they are facilitating the entry of another people into the very same land. And so on to 1933 and the rise of Nazism. And here we have the second giant reason why we have a state of Israel today. The rise of Nazism, of course, led to Jewish immigration, increased immigration. The British still continued with their promises as in the Balfour Declaration. And 1936, it led to the general strike on the part of Palestinians. Huge strike, very crippling, very tragic, 36 to 39, dealt with very brutally by the British authorities. Many Palestinian leaders executed, people starving by the end. This dramatic moment in Palestinian history led to another soul-searching on the part of London, which then came up with the Peel Commission, drawn up by Earl Peel. And that Peel Commission identified the problem that there were two communities now in Palestine, both of which had their own national aspirations, but they were irreconcilable. And so Earl Peel recommended partition. And that is the first time we hear about partition in this formal way. Although I want to remind you that the idea of partition was around right from the beginning, because the British played this role in which they treated the Palestinians in one way, and they treated the Zionist and the Jewish community in another. And so it's a history of blunder, failure, cynicism, political expediency, all at the expense of a people which could in no way have fought that. And I just want to draw attention to the fact, something that I've always thought was very important in this. And although I really very much appreciate Dr. Hassasian's description of Palestinians as not a sort of backward people, in fact, the reality is most of Palestine's population was agricultural. You're quite right that in the cities there was an educated elite, but really the majority of people in Palestine were agricultural. They were not in a position to understand this thing called Zionism. They could not have understood it. Zionism is a product of Europe. It's a highly complex, difficult idea, which it's taken many people to wrestle with, to understand its roots and so on. No way could a Palestinian population with a completely unsophisticated, mostly illiterate and uneducated, could they have possibly coped with understanding what was this force that had invaded them. And that, I think, is terribly sad. I think the British knew it, and they are all the more culpable for having brought in a movement which was far, far more advanced and developed than they were at the time. Thank you.
I'll start with sort of definitions of the term that, for me, that inform my presentation and much of my work. At first, I would like to make a distinction between guilt and responsibility. And indeed, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the people under UK sovereignty, civil society have a responsibility which I'm about to define. But I would suggest that guilt is not ascribed on a collective basis. Every infant born on this land is born as an innocent individual. Any infant born in any part of planet Earth is innocent. There's no collective guilt. But there is a measure of responsibility in the sense that the crimes perpetrated by succession of British governments have been perpetrated in the name of the British people. And in this sense, there is a responsibility on British people to step forward and shout at the top of their voice, "Not in our name." The same distinction applies to any human person, whether Arab or Jewish or Buddhist or Christian. There is no collective guilt, and I made my first mistake here. Arab is not equivalent to Jewish or Christian, etc. So I apologize. But see whether there are bits and pieces in the accords that can serve as useful building blocks for a better future strategy. And it is in this frame that I wish to illustrate my contribution to the title of this conference, Britain's Colonial Legacy in Palestine, by focusing on two highlights. The first is United Nations Resolution 181 of 1947, recommending the partition of the country of Palestine not into two segments, not into a Jewish state and an Arab state, but into three segments: an Arab state, a Jewish state, and the city of Jerusalem as a separate corpus separandum, separate territory under UN administration. And the other, of course, a document proclaimed 30 years earlier, the Balfour Declaration. And I will start with the partition plan for Palestine of 1947, which has been rightfully rejected by the leadership of the Palestinian people at the time. And had I been a conscious adult in 1947, I would have joined that rejection. If you read the Apartheid Israel Declaration of Independence, you will find there a reference to the United Nations Resolution 181 of 1947, claiming that this resolution endows international legitimacy, to a degree at least, to the idea of the Jewish state. And if we insist on reading the resolution also in legal terms, we need and we ought to say that is correct, but not in the political Zionist interpretation of a Jewish state, not in apartheid terms. The resolution allows a measure of international regulation to the idea of a Jewish state, first of all, only in the 1947 borders as delineated in that resolution. Secondly, as a binational state. And then within the frame of a democratic constitution, and the resolution has the black on white, the elements of a democratic liberal constitution for the Jewish state and for the Arab state, and these are mirror constitutions with economic union. I will refer to the Balfour Declaration a bit with a tongue in cheek, because I want to suggest that given the incremental advance of Palestine solidarity and the resistance of the Palestinian people, we can, or at least I can, conceive of a future situation where the leadership of the Palestinian people can take the Balfour Declaration, change it at critical points, and use it to the advantage of the Palestinian people. Again, taking the declaration as formulated and not necessarily as interpreted for political Zionist purposes, for apartheid purposes, for purpose of perpetrating international crimes. Dated November 2nd, 2033. Well, if I'm given another 20 years, I may witness it. I'm 70 this year. Dear Secretary General, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of a federal government of Socialist Democratic Republic of Palestine, the following declaration of sympathy with the aspiration of the Palestinian Hebrew people, which have been submitted to and approved by the Palestinian federal government. The federal government of Palestine view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Hebrew people of Palestine, formalized as the Hebrew state, Wilaya in Arabic, of Palestine, consistent with the terms of UN General Assembly Resolution 1812 of 1947 and 194 of 1948, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Arab communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by people of Jewish origin in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the peoples concerned. Thank you very much.
First, I'll start with my story a bit to tell you who I am and why I'm here. My background is in journalism. I don't happen to be Jewish or Muslim or Arab. My background is Presbyterian. 12 years ago, I was the editor of a very small weekly newspaper in Sausalito, California, writing about the local school district, the city council, the fishing fleet. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life, as it is with 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans who do not have strong views on this issue at all. In fact, really have no views on this issue, the large majority of Americans. I was among them. But then I suddenly saw those images for a brief time in the American news of children throwing stones against tanks in what I learned was the Second Intifada. And of course, I then learned, well, not through the American media, but I learned that just meant uprising, something very familiar with Americans who had an intifada against Britain some centuries ago. I then began to look into it more and more for myself on the internet and eventually multitudes of books, and began to learn that it was entirely different than the impressions I had from watching the movie Exodus, which is the extent of most American understanding. So it seemed so significant to me on so many levels that I finally decided to quit my job in Sausalito and go over and travel throughout the Palestinian territories by myself as a freelance reporter in early 2001, February and March of 2001. And I'll just show you a few of the slides that I took. These are all my photographs. So I saw what a fascinating, rich culture. I met a great deal of wonderful, intelligent, interesting people. I interviewed them with my notebook. I was there as a freelance reporter. I met their families. I was often invited to stay with families, and given the budget of a freelance reporter, I was very happy to accept that accommodation many times, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. I also saw what was happening to these people firsthand. I saw the flowers in the living room, the family photos on the wall. And I saw the family when they returned from the hospital, from their dead child. And I heard the mother and sisters weeping and weeping and weeping. And I saw the father walking around shell-shocked. It looked like he was sleepwalking in a bad dream that will never end. I saw the neighbors come in to try to comfort them. And I heard a man tell the father, when it looked like he was about to break down, "Your son is a bird in heaven now." And I saw the funeral and another funeral for a woman who had just been killed, who had 3 sons, 18, 14, and 12, and had been coming home from the market and had been killed. I won't go into everything. I saw, of course, more and more children who had been shot and injured. I agree with one of the previous speakers who talked about the importance of history. George Orwell, I think very accurately, said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Well, I've shown you in the media who controls the present. And the past is also being controlled. There are very important aspects of the past on this issue, as on all issues, no doubt, that most Americans and most people, in fact, just don't know, and we need to know them. It's essential. So I'll try to fill in a few of the ones that might be the most interesting and the least known, and not repeat the ones that have been articulated earlier today. By 1910, there were already 20,000 Zionists in the U.S. And again, to reiterate what was said previously, this was obviously not close to a majority of Jewish Americans who were actually opposed to Zionism for many, many decades. In 1912, Zionists bragged, Zionist literature is where you learn often the history of this. So they were bragging about how wonderful their propaganda was and how effective and how much there was in the United States. In 1914, I have so little time left, but I'll get into what I can, there was a very significant development, both for the United States, for Palestine, for Israel, and for Balfour. In 1914, a man named Louis Brandeis, who is a very famous Supreme Court justice in the United States, there's a university named after him. Many people that study at universities have heard of the name Louis Brandeis. We've heard of very few previous Supreme Court justices. I could probably name, a handful. An early recruiter explained, quote, "An organization which has the aims we have must be anonymous, must work silently through education and infection. The majority of Americans have no idea. If we can get the information to them, and it won't happen by way of the media, if we can get them, when and if we do get them this information, we will, I feel, bring change. And that will then finally enable justice in Palestine." So thank you.
It traces its roots back to the 19th century when a group of Christians in Britain began to speculate about the end of the world, the place of the Jews within God's purposes, and they had a strong conviction that it was their destiny to assist the Jews to come to recognize Jesus as their Messiah, but also return them to their historic homeland before Jesus could come back. It became known as Christian Zionism, as increasingly Christians in America got behind Zionism as a political movement. Well, they do take them very literally. They take these promises very literally, the promises God made to Abraham, and they believe that they're being fulfilled exclusively through the Jewish people. What they forget to remember is that when the promises were made, Abraham had neither had Isaac or Ishmael. And so from our perspective, we would read those same scriptures and see, yes, the promises were fulfilled through all of his children, not just his Jewish children. But I believe that Christian Zionists read the Bible in an incorrect way. They distort the Bible by taking promises that are 3,000–4,000 years old and applying them today without interpreting them in the light of Jesus' teaching and his apostles. Jesus teaches that we should treat everyone the same, that everyone has the need for food, for clothing, somewhere to live, and therefore it's immoral and it's wrong that we prejudice one people group, the Palestinians, and favor another, the Jewish people. We should treat both peoples the same, and be a force for reconciliation rather than division. How we apply the Bible to a political situation today needs sensitivity, and any religion or theological view that is dogmatic and favors one people group against another is inconsistent. It undermines the teaching of the New Testament, which teaches us to have compassion for the poor, for widows, for orphans, for the stranger, and to treat those who recognize Jesus as our brothers and sisters. Therefore, if that's our overriding understanding of our responsibility to one another, then when we apply them politically, we can't favor one people group over against another. So either we support the two-state solution with Palestine as an independent, sovereign state alongside Israel, or we recognize Jews and Palestinians as citizens of one state, be it Israel, Palestine, or whatever. But the present political system, which prejudices Palestinians, that exclusively takes that land and gives it to the Jews or to Zionists, is not sustainable theologically for Christians or politically, as we see today.
It's when the Palestinian uprising began about 12 years ago, and I saw that in the news, I began to think, well, I'll try to understand Israel-Palestine and follow the news on this issue. And I quickly noticed how one-sided the news seemed to be, that it was really almost always about Israel and from the Israeli point of view, and we rarely got the Palestinian information. So that got me more and more curious. I looked into it more and more, and eventually I went over there and traveled as a freelance reporter by myself to just see for myself what was going on. Well, the trouble is most Americans, of course, Palestine's far away, and so they rely on the media to give us the information. And some people will try to read various newspapers and magazines and maybe watch various news reports on television, and they're doing their job to try to get the information. The news media are not doing their job because both the liberal media and the conservative media are doing a very poor job of giving the full story about Israel-Palestine.